Hi, welcome back to my channel. Josie here, and this is Josie, and this is part 2 of sewing Burda 05 2021 pattern number 107. That's the dress I'm showing you here. Yes, I'm working in the future that I'm showing you the dress, and yet I'm going to show you the sew along. Yeah, and this was a nice dress to make. I know many of you requested to see the sew along, so I'm going to take you through each and every step. Ideally, I won't be taking you to the sewing machine, but I will be taking you through the steps of what exactly I'm doing from the table, showing you which seams we are sewing. And if that's something you're interested in, you can sit along. And also, if you did get a chance to watch the part 1 where I show you how to cut out your pattern and also how to trace a pattern from the magazines, I will attach the link in the description box below and also in the cards above here. Hope you enjoy that. I've cut out all our pattern pieces, and you could cross check on your list that you have each and every piece and you have them in the recommended amount. And over here we have our side front pieces, and the side pieces I decided to cut them with the lines running vertically. So these are the pieces and they're running downwards. That's the front side piece. Make sure you have that. Then I've also bought the back side pieces. There are also two. The front pieces, the front side pieces were 2, and so are the back pieces. And I cut both with the stripes running vertical. Then the straps, I decided to cut them. I measured the pattern pieces and I cut them out with just a ruler without cutting out the pattern pieces because they were perfect rectangles. Then I've got the yoke pieces, and I also had to cut out 2 of them. And then the sleeves, I've gone with the short sleeves from version 106 if you didn't see the cutting process. And I have 2 of them still. Then we've got the center fold, the center back, and the center front. That's the panel in the center. And you can easily mix them up because they're quite similar, but just make sure you keep the pattern pieces attached to them so you don't mix them up. They're a bit different, they're not exactly the same. So just in case you make an error and you find that things are not fitting right, you cross check that you didn't interchange these pieces. That's the front center piece and the back center piece, and they are each cut on the fold. And for this I cut the stripes running horizontal. I just wanted to have an effect with the pattern pieces. And then over here we've got both the back and the front facings, and these facings will be sewn underneath. And I'm going to go ahead and cut up interfacing for them, and you would try and go with interfacing similar to the same weight. I know I don't have enough of the similar weight. I might use one slightly heavy, but it shouldn't matter really. I might do that off camera. Then we start sewing our dress. I've looked through the pattern instructions. They're pretty good compared to what most times I find with Burda's magazine patterned instructions, because there's a dress I cut out 2 years, and up to now I've never finished sewing it up because it was quite complicated to follow. Otherwise, let me get the interfacing attached to these pieces, and then we shall come back and start sewing. I've added interfacing to the facing pieces, and this is our front facing. This is what interfacing does. It makes it more stable because this is a drapey fabric. It's a blend of linen and viscose. So the viscose in it makes it a bit drapey. So this has given it stability. So I'll put these interfacing pieces away, but make sure you keep the labels, the pattern pieces with them, because they're quite identical. You can mistake them for the other. So you try to put them in separate places. And now we are going to start with a construction process. First step is going to be putting these pieces together. So we need the center front piece and also the side front pieces. And the side front pieces have a notch. If you can tell, over here I marked off the notch. I try to raise it up a bit. That notch, I marked it off on the fabric, and it's up to that point that this piece will stop. That's where you stop stitching onto the side panels. And also you have to be careful to tell which side is actually the bottom end, because they're quite identical. So you need to mark off all these things, because now here the seam allowance is different for the hem allowance. So that's what helps me tell which one is the top and which one is the back. And it's important that you cross check and make sure actually they match up, because they are all narrow but they're not a rectangle. One side is wider than the other, so you have to take into consideration that bit. So this is my side front middle piece. So we are going to go ahead and pin it onto this. Our first step in the sewing process, we are going to pin this is the center panel to the side center, the center front panel. We are going to attach it to the sides, the front sides, and we are going to align the top to the notch we marked off here. That's where all the stitching must stop, and I marked off notches that were on our pattern pieces to this. So we are going to align up the pattern pieces. I won't be showing each and every step. I'm going to pin it together from the top to the bottom, and I will also do it to the second piece, and then I come back to you. I've attached the side fronts to the center panel, the center front piece. I pinned everything together. Like I said, I made the side stripes run vertically, and the center panel ones horizontal. So I'm going to go to my sewing machine. I won't be taking it to the machine because it will be a lot of back and forth. So I'm going to stitch up to, I've aligned the panel piece to the notch we have here. So I'm going to go ahead, sew it down, then also finish the seams together with my overlocker. So I'll come back to you when we are done with this piece, and I'll take you through the next step. I've managed to sew the center pieces together. I sewed the panel, the front panel to the side front pieces together. This is what it looks like. This is the effect I wanted, with the stripes running the opposite direction. This is a viscose linen, so it drips a bit, and also it seems like it's bulgy or grows on itself, but I think it will still be perfect. And we've sewed it all together, matched it up at the notches. That's why we stopped sewing, back stitched, and this is what it looks like up to the hem. We shall put this to the side. Then the next step, we're going to put our straps together. Those will be our ties, the straps of the ties. We're going to sew, leave one side at the edge open. We're going to sew down and close, finish the seams, and we shall just clip in the triangle at the corner here, in the corner, so it's not bulky here. Then turn them inside out, and also at that point we shall iron them flat, and I'll come back to you. I want to take you to the sewing machine, like I said, to save on time. At least we know we are just sewing with straight stitches and finishing seams when we need to. I don't need to finish the seams of this. However, this fabric frays quite a little bit because it's a loose weave, but it's all fine. With the straps we don't need to do that, and we are following the seam allowance you choose to use, and I'm using 3/8 of an inch because that's what I added onto my pattern pieces. But if you're happy with 1/2 inch or 5/8 of an inch, keep consistent with the seam allowance, you'll get the same product in the end. At this point, I've sewn ties together, turn them inside out, and iron them flat. So I've got our 2 ties, and then we are going to get our center back panel. That's the one we cut on the fold, and on it we should look out for the notches we made, and those notches are supposed to give us a point where the ties should be attached. And because I want this line to appear at the front when I put together my ties, so I'm going to align it in such a way that it's what appears. You align the stripes along the notches, and you go ahead over your machine and just best stitch them. Best stitching is ideally sewing them together with the longer stitch. It won't be the final stitch because we shall be sewing them in between. So you could go ahead and do that part. Then we shall also align this together. So I'm going to go ahead and best stitch down here and over here, and this will be put to the side. And then we are going to get our back side panels. We've been working with the center back panel. That's where we've attached the straps. So now we are going to our back side panels, and what we are going to do, we are going to gather the top pieces, and it's these that we are going to attach to the yoke piece. And by gathering, we are going to use 2 lines of stitching, still the basting stitch, that's the loose stitch that we've used to attach the straps to the center panel. We're going to do 2 rows of gathering, and we shall pull them together. I'll bring you here after I've sewn those 2 rows. And now let me go to my sewing machine and I do those 2 parts. At this point, we've attached our straps to the back center panel. We shall put this to the side, and then we've also sewn basting stitches to gather our side panels. These are the back side panels. I've used 2 lines of stitching. I'll just lift it up. 2 lines of stitching. One can be out of the seam allowance, or within. You can always get rid of, pull them out after you finish attaching the pieces together. But I think my second one aligns to the seam allowance, but there's no rule really, because it's a basting stitch. It's easy to move, and the best way to gather the fabric is by using the bobbin threads. That's the 2 threads that are the bottom, because we want to gather it so it's small enough to fit onto the yoke. As you may tell, it's wider than the yoke, so we are going to gather it so it actually lines up properly with the yoke piece. This is our yoke piece. So I'll just show you on one how I'll go ahead and gather it. Just make sure you separate the 2 threads and you work with just the bottom threads. That's our bobbin thread. I know it looks quite hard to follow, but something easy to work with. I've gotten one, then you get the second. It's good to gather them all together. You could use 1 line of stitching, but 1 line doesn't give even gathers. So I always prefer gathering with 2 stitches, and that's what actually the pattern also recommends. So I'm going to pull them a bit, spread them evenly, because we want to make sure that they match up with the panel piece that we are going to work with. I use the longest stitch on my sewing machine to create this. And before we can tie them off, we can try to align them together and see what matches. Yeah, we've gathered it pretty much. So I could go ahead and mark off, join one end together. Then I spread out the gathers so they line up really. I didn't need to pull them that tight. But there's no harm in that, because you can still adjust it. It's temporary, it's not permanent. I'm easing the gathers a bit so we can get them lining up properly together. Yeah, we are almost there. I could still loosen them up a bit. I'm going to attach them together and try to ease them so that they spread evenly. So my gathering is tight. It's a loose gather per se, as you may tell. So I've managed to line them all together. I'm going to go over my sewing machine, sew a proper stitch. Now this is your ordinary stitch, and the length you used to sew with. And also I'll finish up the edges, and I'll also iron it flat. I'll probably iron it to the bottom, and I'll come back and show you. And I made sure that the yoke stripes run horizontal so it matches up nicely together. Okay, I'll show you later. We've attached the yoke pieces to the gathered backside panels. As you may tell, it's actually a light gather. It's not thick. When I did that, I finished up the seam. I also finished up the edges, the raw edges. So I ironed them flat and got the seams to face downwards. So these are side panels. So the next step is to attach the center back panel. These are the side back panels. So we're going to attach the center back panel to the center of these pieces, and that will be with right sides together. So we have to play around with it, that we have the positioning right with how these panels will lie onto each other. So it's the same thing that I've done earlier. I don't have to really take you through each and every step. And it helped that we had actually already stitched the straps together, because if we hadn't done that, it would have been harder to play around with them. Okay, with right sides together, you attach them all together. And we are going to match up the edge with the seam we've created with the gathers. So that's how we are matching them all up. It's at that point that you pin it up to the very bottom. It lines up nicely, so you can pin it up. So with the straight stitch, and also finish the edges, your raw edges. And I'm going to do that to both sides of the side panels. Then I'll come back to you for the next step. And with this, we shall also have put together all the back pieces, just like how we did with the front pieces. Okay, I'll come back to you when that step is all done. At this point, we've sewn the middle the back middle piece to the side pieces. And our next step is pretty straightforward. We are going to join the front pieces to the back pieces. That's at the shoulders. So we are going to go ahead, stitch these together, finish up the seams like we've been doing. And after that, the next step will be sewing these two seams together. That's the front facing and the back facing that we interfaced already. We are also going to join them up at this seam, which they call also seam number 5. And when all that is done, we shall actually be attaching that piece to the middle piece. I'll probably come and I show you how I'll be connecting them together, but not to mix them up. I've just added a pin to my front facing piece, so I know which one I should match up with which other, because they are pretty the same but not exactly the same. One is lower than the other, so you could just mark it any other way you know best to do, so you don't mix them up. At this point, I've sewn the shoulder seams together on both the dress and also on the facing. Now I'm going to align the facing onto the dress, and probably it's a straightforward procedure. Just like I showed you, I marked off my front facing piece so I don't mix them up. I'm going to pin them up, make sure I align the shoulders together, finished up all the seams of the shoulders. I also went ahead and finished up with my overlocker the seams of the facing. I know the instructions don't tell you to do that, but I think it's something that you should be doing. Finish up the edges because I don't want them to unravel. Sorry, there's a lot of thread from the overlocker running around. So I'm going to go ahead, pin them together. And once I've pinned them, I'm going to take them to a sewing machine, sew with my 3/8 of an inch. And then after, I'll press them inside. I think I'll show you that step. I'll press them inside and try to understitch, where you try to sew the seam allowance against the facing itself. Probably I'll show you when I get to that stage. I've sewn the facing onto the main fabric. However, I've encountered a few issues. I found that the main fabric stretched out a bit. I think because now the sides of that's the front, the side panels really, they were cut a bit on the bias. Definitely the facing didn't stretch because it has interfacing, which is stabilizing it. And this is a bit of a loose weave of fabric. So I found it was growing on me. So probably when you're sewing, before you join the pieces together, I would advise you to stitch the raw edges of the side pieces because they're pretty much cut on the bias at that point. If you stitch them, they won't grow on you. So I've had to play around with taking in the extra fabric. But now that I've done that, I'm going to go ahead. They don't tell you this part to turn it, but I'm going to go ahead and cut into the corners. So I can be careful not to cut into your fabric. I want to cut into the corners so I can be able to turn the fabric. And also, the pattern doesn't tell you to understitch. Understitching is pretty much ironing the fabric flat and sewing the seam allowance onto the facing. You sew very close to the seam and sew it onto the facing so it reduces bulk. And also it's important to cut out the extra bulk as you go, but I'm not going to do it at this point because it will be hard to catch it while I'm under stitching. I'll do it after. So I'm going to go sew very close to the seam line. So very close to the seam line at that point as I turn, and because I'll have clipped in the corners here, it will be easy to turn and work around it, because all that the pattern is telling you is to iron it to the back and hand stitch it in the corners there. But I think it would lie better flat if I do that. Probably after I've understitched very close to the seam line, I'll go and reduce the bulk of the seam allowance. That will be, I'll cut a bit of the inside layer as opposed to the one, I'll cut a bit of the interface layer because it's the thicker one. And also it's not what will be exposed there. So I'm going to go to my machine and try to understitch, but pretty much before I do that, I want to try to iron the interfacing away from the main fabric. And also flatten this so it will be easier to fold in and sew close to the seam. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'll bring it back to you when I'm done. So I'm going to clip in all the corners, making it easier. Pardon me, this fabric frays a lot because it's quite a loose weave, but I'll be able to cut the edges of the inside one after I've understitched with my pinking shear so it doesn't continue fraying. But I'll show you when I've done that and sewn it all flat. So I'm going to iron it flat, understitch, and then cut out any bulk of in the seam allowance. Okay, I'll show you our next step after that. I've managed to stitch the facing down to the seam allowance. As you may tell, the seam allowance has been stitched to the facing, and that helps for it not to roll over or to come out. With that, we have a straight edge. However, there's a bit of bulk here. I might go in and trim it a little bit to reduce the bulk that's underneath. And probably I can't cut, if I cut all the layers, because we've got the body layer and also the facing layer, I might go in and just snip the back of the interfacing, the one of the facing a little bit, but carefully not cut into my fabric to reduce the bulk, because there's a lot of bulk mostly at these corners because I was working with so many layers, the join, the seam here and everything. So I'm going to go in. You don't want to cut both because it will be, actually it won't be layered and it will be bulky. So you just need to cut one of them shorter than the other. But remember, we've already stitched, so there's so little to cut out, but it helps to reduce the bulk. And I would be lying if I say that it's sewed without any drama, because now here, this is where the fabric grew on me when I was telling you that it's important to stitch. But it will be all fine because it's a drapey fabric. There's not much going on, not much bulk, but probably with a bit of pressing, it will be all right. So after I've cut out all that, we pretty much have our dress. I'm going to go sew the side seams together and finish up the edges. Then I'll come back to you after all that is done. I'm going to sew that side seam to this one. Our dress is pretty much all together. Then after that, I'll show you what we shall be doing to the sleeves. So I'm going to pin it all together, sew it, and finish the raw edges. Okay, I'll show you when I get to that point. I've sewed the side seams all together and finished the seam allowance with my covers, with my overlocker. That's it, all the side seams are sewn. All we have to do is to attach the sleeves. So off camera, I went and also sewed the sleeves right sides together, closed both sleeves, and I'm using the sleeves from dress 106, which is short sleeve, just in case you missed that. Otherwise, if I was using the sleeves on our dress, they've got an elastic at the bottom. They're like bishop sleeves, so I would go ahead, fold it down, then attach an elastic, create a casing for the elastic, then attach it. But that step is gone. We don't have to do that. So now that we've sewn our sleeves together, I'm going to go ahead and sew some basting stitches. I know there are markings that I should have transferred onto the pattern marking, but I will just eyeball it. Alternatively, go back to the pattern piece, get your sleeve piece, and try to align it to the pattern paper and mark off the little markings that show you how far you should sew the gathering stitches. I could estimate I could just sew 2 lines of basting stitches that will help me gather the sleeve, this piece, which will be fitting onto this sleeve head. It's actually called the sleeve head. 2 basting stitches that will gather the sleeve head so that it can fit into the sleeve openings on my dress. So I'll go ahead, sew those 2 stitches, running stitches on both. That's the longest stitch you can sew on off your machine. Then I'll come back and show you, and we attach it to our dress. We are almost done with it. I've sewn our basting stitches that were 2 lines of stitching. Closer, I tried to use 1/8 or 2/8, an eighth, and also 3/8 of an inch. So this might appear out on our dress, but because it's a basting stitch, you can always remove it. And so at the back we have our bobbin threads, and it's what helps you with gathering the fabric. When you use 2 lines of stitching, they help give an even gather. So I'm going to go ahead and just gather it a bit. Remember, we have a notch on top, which is on top of our sleeve head, which will be matching the shoulder seam. And also we've got 1 notch onto the, I think it's the back one, because Burda doesn't give you both the front and the back notches, but at least if you've matched up them, 1 notch on the sides and 1 notch at the sleeve head, it should be really okay, good to follow along. And I'll go ahead and try to adjust it onto the opening, the sleeve opening on my dress. So we could go ahead and try it. This is our dress, and we've got them. The notch we have is at the back, so we are going to be aligning the notch on the sleeve onto the back. Sorry, there's a lot of loose thread. Here is our top notch, and we're going to align it with the shoulders over here. Pin them in place. Then also we want to line up our back notch. So over here to the back dress. I could as well first line up the seams, seam line seam. Then you line up the notches. Honestly, this step is straightforward. If you've sewed up a dress and attached sleeves, it's straightforward, but I just decided to leave it in just in case there's someone who is quite adventurous to sew with Burda style magazines patterns, but you still have not sewed up so many. So I'm trying to pull the threads out of the way, and I'm just gathering this so it fits. I'm going to pin it up to the end of the gathers. Once you pin it up to the end of the gathers, then you try to make sure that the gathers fit onto it. You can use as many or as few pins as you may want. Even in the back here, I don't have any notch to match up with, but I'm going to pin it together until I get to where the gathering stitches were pinned. That's our running stitches, or the basting stitches for gathers. So then I will love to align the other pieces all together. And our basting stitches come up to there. So I'm pinning it all together. So now we have to fit in this sleeve head. Hope it's all clear to us. We have to fit our sleeve head onto this. So we shall continue through pulling the threads so they fit right. Make sure you have your 2 threads, bobbin threads, that you pull, and make sure they actually match up. At this point we can tell that the dress, the opening is quite bigger. We still try to ease it in. We won't have a well-defined gather, but you just make sure that you ease them in so they align nicely. Then over this side, we pulled it in a lot more than we need, but it's not a big deal because no thread was lost. You still adjust it as long as you've matched up the middle notch, the top notch, the notch at the top of the sleeve head with the shoulder sleeve, then the rest will fall in place. I'm easing the gathering. Got carried away pulling them so much, so we still have a little bit to go. That is pretty much there. So you pin it in place. And over here you can use as many or as few pins that you may want, whatever works for you. Yep, so I'm going to go to my sewing machine and sew all around into the sleeve hole, sleeve gap, sleeve opening, and also finish all the edges, and I'll do it also to the other side, and we shall be pretty much done, but I'll show you what it looks like at that point. I've inserted sleeves into our dress. It's pretty much done, really. It was easy, and I finished all the seams. Once you finish them up, all the rough threads that we are pulling out are concealed in, then I'll just be going in and tucking in the overlocker end. But after that, I went ahead and finished the sleeve hems with just my overlocker, and also finished the bottom hem, the dress hem. So I'm going to just pin it down. I know I'd left some allowance for the hem. I'd left some allowance of just 3/4, but because the dress seems long enough, so I'll do an inch at the bottom, but I'll leave it at 3/4 on the sleeves because I don't want them coming off so short. I know that 1/4 of an inch is quite insignificant, but I could still do an inch or 3/4. That I'll do off camera, then I'll show you the final dress after. Okay, see you later when I'm done with the dress. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed watching the sew along of this dress. I'm going to show you a clip of me in this dress and a few images of it, and actually I love the dress. I like that the pattern gave room for me to play around with the stripes and them running horizontally for the middle panels, both front and back, as you may tell. And also I got these ones to run to the sides vertically on the side, and I also match the sleeves so that they match up. And I like the V neckline feature. It's not V neckline, I like the square neckline feature. And also the straps help cinch in the dress, because without these straps, dress would have been quite roomy, not something you want to watch. So I'll attach a link and you see what it looks like on me. Other than that, thank you for tuning in and thank you for watching. Let me know if these are the kinds of videos you'd be interested in watching sew-alongs from the Burda magazines, because I tend to buy almost an issue every month. I've collected a few over the years. So let me know if this is something you've enjoyed watching and you would want to watch more. Otherwise, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, please like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.